So we've had some opportunities over the last couple of weeks to talk about several different things when it comes to the powers. And Ephesians chapter 6, Paul, who's wrapping up his letter to the church in Ephesus, writes that they should put on the armor of God and be prepared to stand against the wiles of the devil, against the performances of the devil. And then he kind of lays that out. And he says, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood." And he talks about authorities and powers. And so we've been looking at the powers as the things that we just assume are true about the world, the things that we just assume that's just the way things are. And so we've looked at several different things. We've talked about possessions, we've talked about intellect, we've talked about tradition, we've talked about comfort. And today we're going to talk about approval. And it's interesting because as the time of the year that we're actually experiencing right now, kids are finishing up school, getting awards and degrees, and we love to do that. We love to show our approval and our blessing on our kids when they perform well and study hard and do the things that we've asked them to do. But approval is such a subtle thing. And I think it makes its position as a power really so powerful because it is so subtle. A lot of times we seek approval because the opposite is to risk rejection. The opposite of it is to fall out of approval or to be seen as an outsider. And those are things that most of us really just don't like. And so approval is one of those things because we have a tendency to perform for others and we use it to identify ourselves. Like, do people like us? Do people agree with us? Now, the opposite, of course, can be true. And certainly there can be some problems there when people angle for disapproval. And that can be just as strong because we want to be rejected for different reasons and seen as an outsider because it gives us the approval within ourselves or within a subgroup of folks that make us feel better about ourselves. But Jesus talked about this in Matthew chapter 6 in the Sermon on the Mount, and he says this, "Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven." Now, it doesn't mean there's not a reward. He actually talks about that at another point. It just means that the heavenly reward is gone because the earthly reward is already gained. You got what you wanted. You wanted to be seen by others. You wanted to be noticed. You wanted to be said you were right, and you got it, and that's your reward. So he says this, "So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you." He follows that up with the instructions on prayer and how we should pray. And what we now call the model prayer, we used to call the Lord's Prayer. And it's so succinct because it means that just this place and position we have with God is different than the place and position that many times we try to gain with men. And approval can be so subtle because it can replace God and still appear to be very religious. One of the things that Jesus is laying out here is that these people were doing good things. They were really doing good things, but they were doing them for their own reward, for the classification of being seen as a good person, as a person to be honored. And he goes on to say that, "And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others." And so our calling in life is to understand that there is a tendency within us to seek approval, to want approval. It's not a bad thing because we're created to be relational people. However, it can become the motivating factor in our lives, especially spiritually. And when that happens, we actually create an idol, the idea of who we are versus God himself. And so it's a reminder for us to ensure that we're always faithful to keep God in his position, that he's the one we seek. And there's so many Proverbs that attest to this, and you could look them up. You know, the fear of God comes before men, etc. You could look up all of those, but I gave us one. It's from Proverbs chapter 27 and verse 21. And I thought, for me, it was the most challenging, and it's this: "The crucible for silver and the furnace for gold." Now, if you're not familiar with those terms, basically that's how you refine silver, and you take it from silver with impurities to a purified silver. And then the furnace for gold, same thing. You're burning off all the impurities and separating the true gold from the other impure metals. And listen to what he says after that: "The crucible for silver and the furnace for gold, but people are tested by their praise." One of the greatest things that will test us is the approval that we seek from others and how much that defines our lives and how much we allow it to define us. So let's not let that be a power that holds authority over us, but let's trust in the faithfulness of God, and let's put on the armor of God, salvation, truth, and live in those things knowing that He is the true standard and our hope is in Him. God bless you, and I'll see you next time.